Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Is a new Israeli government going to be formed? I mean, are we going to be going to fifth elections, or are they going to get their acts together and make some type of coalition? That's what we'll be talking about today, the possibilities. And what's with the Hamas now after there's been a ceasefire and there's been relative quiet? There were terror attacks in Israel. We don't know who's instigating those. The Hamas certainly has an influence. But what is with the Hamas on a general level now after the latest round of shooting against Israel and Israel retaliating and hurting it? So we're going to be discussing these two topics on the show. You're listening to the Tamar Yonah Show here at IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. We're going to be talking about, as I said, the Israeli coalition talks, the current state of the conflict with Hamas, Hamas and the rioting of Arabs on the Temple Mount here in Jerusalem, and them fighting each other. Not just Jews, but they're fighting each other now, the Arabs. And the U.S. Democrat representatives supporting Hamas terrorists against Israel. Don't forget, the United States deems the Hamas as a terrorist group, and yet you have congresswomen who are going around supporting Hamas terrorists against Israel. And an appeal to American Jews to walk away from a growing anti-Israel party. And I think that our guest is going to say that that is the Democratic Party. He's going to tell you why. All this coming up in the show today. I do want to state that I did a show on Sunday, and that was about how the ceasefire bombs. And I went into all the reasons, well, I don't know all, I didn't have time, but I went into many reasons why Israelis are against the ceasefire, the Israeli people, and yet the government did it, and why I believe it's a mistake, a serious mistake, because it's just basically kicking the can down the road. But I didn't give a call to action afterwards. I just kind of presented the facts why it was not a positive thing, why we should have finished off the Hamas. But the call to action on that is to pray that our leadership sees the light and does what it needs to do in order to protect its people and bring peace and prosperity to the region by taking out terrorists. We'll be right back.
The return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel was prophesied in the Bible thousands of years ago and is coming true today. Shalom. Join me, Josh Wander, on Israel Unplugged. Listen in as we delve into the spiritual and physical aspects of the Jewish return to Zion. We'll discuss the biblically mandated, historic, and of course practical understandings of this incredible transition from exile to redemption. That's Israel Unplugged, every Monday on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
All right, we are back here at the Tamar Yonah Show on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. And the topics we're going to be talking about today is a new Israeli government in the making? What's going on with the coalition talks? And what's with the Hamas now after the ceasefire? Our guest is Barry Shaw. He is the International Public Diplomacy Director at the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies. He's also a book author, and he's written books called Fighting Hamas, BDS and Anti-Semitism, BDS for Idiots, and 1917 From Palestine to Israel. He has more books as well. They're all available on Amazon or at your local Steinmatsky bookstore here in Israel. And you can visit his website at theviewfromisrael.com and www.strategic-israel.org. Welcome to the show, Barry Shaw.
Thank you, Tamar. Thank you for having me. And can I plug another book, which is called A Tale of Love and Destiny, which we should talk about on another show because it
We shall.
tells the life and times of a Jewish heroine, and it's a very dramatic story.
That's right. If you like historical novels, you're going to want to get hold of that book. All right. So, Barry, right now, the news focus is off of Corona. It's off of the war. Since we have this quote unquote ceasefire right now, we cease and they fire. That's how it usually works.
Yeah.
And so now it's right back to the Knesset again to see who's going to, the chess pieces are moving around. And is there going to be a coalition made, or are we going to go to fifth elections? What do you say?
Yeah, all right. Well, let's start off with, I guess, with a bit of a reminder because the elections were put on the back foot thanks to 4,300 Hamas rockets. So basically what we had up till now was that Benjamin Netanyahu had his period to try to form a government and he failed. And then the President Rivlin gave the task to Yair Lapid and he had 40 days to form a government. Of course, he lost about more than 2 weeks of that because of thanks to Hamas. He's got until June the 2nd to form a government. And if he fails, any member of the Knesset has then 21 days to draft 61 other members of the Knesset to build a coalition. And then if no one succeeds, we're heading for another election, number 5. So where did we start? Where were we before the Hamas rockets fell? Well, Yair Lapid was coming together what looked like a potential coalition with his own party, Yesh Atid, Blue and White, Labour, Israel Beitenu, that's Lieberman, Yamina, that's Bennett, New Hope, that's Gideon Saar, Meretz, far left, a total of 57. Well, it should have been 58, actually, but one of Bennett's members fled, a guy called Amichai Chikli, who said he would never vote in such a government, a left-wing government. So that deprived Bennett of one of his own party. But the government still needed a magical 61. Okay, so that's 57. Where's the missing 4? And at that time, the 4 was potentially going to be, strangely enough, the Ram Party, which is the Arab Islamist party headed by a guy called Mansour Abbas. And he had 4 seats in the last election. And he was talking about supporting a Lapid-led government, but from the outside, not within the party. And that would have given Lapid 61 seats, enough to form a government. Of course, that all was literally blown out of the water by the conflict we had imposed on us by Hamas. Now, Lapid has come back in the last day or two to start rapidly trying to put the same coalition together, but things have happened. Naftali Bennett really put himself in the middle of a storm when he said that party leaders must be prepared, I'm quoting him, to make compromises to avoid another election. And he didn't say who he was referring to, but most people seem to think he was talking about Gideon Saar, who had refused to enter into a government led by Netanyahu. So they thought that Bennett was talking about Gideon Saar if he joined Netanyahu and the Likud, then that would open the way for Bennett to also join in and give Bibi a majority, despite the fact that the file was now with Bennett. But that didn't stop this is gossips going on. Things are going on below the surface we don't know about it. Things bubble up, and some people at the top of the Likud took a shot of him because he didn't know what political side he's on. And Bennett has said, whoever drags us into a 5th election condemns us to another year of not being able to function properly as a state. And there are people, quite frankly, who are accusing him of doing just that. And Bennett himself, he seems to be waffling. And his party seems to be fracturing. Now, the other thing we should look out for if you want to assess what's happening, there was a recent TV poll that showed that the majority of Israelis, and for your listeners, this might sound strange, considering we've had 12 days of over 4,000 Hamas rockets.
Okay.
But this poll said that the majority of Israelis were unhappy with the ceasefire.
Yes.
Look, I guess your listeners in other countries would be saying, if we had 4,000 rockets, we would be begging our government to have a ceasefire. But the Israelis wanted it to continue until we had eradicated Hamas. We'll be talking about this later on.
Right.
That, by the way, would be an enormous benefit to the people of Gaza. But the majority of Israelis were disappointed that we didn't see the conflict reach the conclusion that most Israelis wanted. And that probably will have an effect on even Lapid's ability to form a government. And quite frankly, it would have an effect if we go to a fifth election as well, because Israelis will bear that in mind. So we have more than the fog of war hiding or delaying Lapid's ability to use the remaining time to form a government. And this is what if he does manage to form a government, I'm strange to say this, but perhaps the big hero that will drag him over the finish line is going to be an Arab, Mansour Abbas, the leader of the Islamabad party. Because if he goes ahead and decides to join Lapid and Bennett's party doesn't fracture anymore, we could still have a Lapid-led government. But the problem is the internal violence that we've seen in Israel, where Arabs have been on the rampage and some Jews have been fighting back, has put a strain on any Arab politician who wants to reach into the mainstream of Israeli politics, even for the benefit of the Arab community in Israel, because they or he will be uncertain if local Arabs will not turn violently against them. There's also a poll, by the way, projecting a future election, which is interesting, if you want to hear it.
Well, I'm just thinking, Barry, yesterday on WhatsApp, there was a video going around of the Arabs on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem attacking their own mufti because he didn't talk about Hamas in his speech and give Hamas credit. And so they were throwing things at him. He had to hide behind, I don't know what he was hiding behind. It was really something to see. And this is like, it's like throwing something at your priest, right? The people turning on. It's quite incredible what's going on in the Arab world right now.
Yeah, I was going to save that to later, but this is the added new dimension, as you rightly said yesterday, that we not only had the Palestinians going on the rampage and stabbing attacks, and also Hamas having a go at us again. We'll talk about this in more greater detail. But the phenomenon we saw yesterday was actually Arab against Arab. So it shows how fractured even the Arab society is. And maybe, coming back to what I said earlier, it may be the fact that even the Arabs themselves within Israel need somebody who can calm them down and bring them into the fold. And maybe that person might be this Mansour Abbas. I don't know. But just completing what we were saying, that although the Likud in this poll projecting a future election, although Likud still held 30 seats as it did last time, Lapid jumped from 18 seats to 21. And this was mainly at the expense of Bennett's party, Yamina, who has, according to the poll, sank from 7 down to 5. So Bennett seems to have a sinking party. And the outcome, though, still shows that even in another election, it will be as equally hard, if not harder, for either side to form a majority. So we've got to start thinking, how the heck can we stop this madness of having elections every 6 months? And one of the ways to do it is we really have to reform our election system, possibly by raising the election threshold from 3.5% for somebody to get a seat in the Knesset to go even up to 6% or maybe even 88% for a party to enter or somebody to enter into the Knesset. That would mean a lot of small parties wouldn't really have any hope of making it into the Knesset. Maybe some of the Israeli parties would have to copy what the Arabs do and they have a joint Arab list. Maybe some of them would come together, maybe like Meretz and Labour or other sort of coalitions like that. So we would have larger blocks of parties, which at the end of the day may make it better to be able to have a government formed with a minimum 61-seat majority.
Right, but people have to realize also that these bloc parties still have their own little interests, and many times these blocs are not strong, like we saw with the blue and white. They parted and were, went their own ways after Gantz went with Bibi and Lapid went to the opposition. And this happens all the time that these blocs break up. But go ahead.
Yeah, but again, you're right. It doesn't mean that these blocks would stay that way. I mean,
okay, hang on. We'll be right back.
Hi, everyone. This is Andrea Siminto from Jerusalem, inviting you to drop everything and join me on my show, Pull Up a Chair. We'll visit this week's quirky stories, meet fabulous guests, and discover my Israel. Together, we'll laugh, shout, and explain the topics that make us say, hey, we've got to talk about that. So get comfortable and pull up a chair with me, Andrea Siminto, every Thursday on Israel News Talk Radio.
All right, well, we are back here at the Tamar Yonah Show on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. And in the last segment, we're talking about what is happening now with the Israeli government, what's with the coalition talks. And we pretty much established that they're still talking. Everyone's trying to make a deal. We still don't know where the which court it's going to fall in, and or if we're just going to have to go to new elections. And we're going to turn our focus now to the aftermath of the ceasefire, because the Hamas, unfortunately and sadly, is still in power in Gaza. So what's with the Hamas now? We have the Secretary of State who is coming to Israel, and he's going to be, speaking with the Arabs and speaking with Israel and trying to set a more firm foundation to keep the ceasefire holding. Where would you like to take this, Barry Shaw?
Yeah, I just want to remind your listeners of a strange coincidence, because we've had our elections ruined, I suppose, messed up by Hamas in the latest unprovoked massive rocket attack against Israel and Israelis. But I just want to take you back 25 years. In 1996, just when the then Prime Minister Shimon Peres was heading to an election, looked like he was going to win, and he was strongly backed by US President Bill Clinton, Hamas at that time went on a horrific suicide bombing campaign that even Peres said was instrumental in his losing to Benjamin Netanyahu by a razor-thin margin. That was 25 years ago. And how ironic it is that here, 25 years later, the same terrorist organization, this time employing missiles and rockets rather than suicide bombers, has actually probably affected an election over here. But I'll come back on something what you referred to. Yes, we're waiting for the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, to come to Israel. And he says the purpose of his visit is to make sure that the Israel-Hamas ceasefire holds. In other words, to maintain the status quo.
Right.
I think Mr. Blinken ought to be reminded that if anybody won out of this latest conflict, it was Hamas, in the sense that they absolutely now control the hearts and minds of the Arabs who would be voting in any future Palestinian election.
Meaning, wait, let me just say here, meaning that the Fatah PLO under Mahmoud Abbas is going to lose its power in the face of the Hamas rising up. Go ahead.
The body is dead, but the coroner hasn't come to announce it dead. It died. This is the reason that Mahmoud Abbas cancelled the election at the end of the day, because he knew that in the election for party, he was on his way to losing in any case at that time against Hamas. And even if it came to the presidential election, he was probably going to lose out to people like Marwan Barghouti, who is in jail serving 5 life sentences for mass murder against Jews. So that even if the Palestinian Authority had won and they would have had Barghouti as their president, the Palestinian who the United States and the European Union were dealing with would have a mass murdering Jew killer as their president. But even without that, if Hamas was on its way to winning the election then, it would absolutely win any election going forward. I don't believe the penny has dropped with Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, when he's coming to make sure that the ceasefire holds. In other words, to maintain the status quo. In other words, keep Hamas in place.
Right, in power.
They haven't woken up that Hamas is an internationally designated terror organization, an Islamic terror organization. And if the last 2 weeks the penny hasn't dropped with the United States, when will it drop? There is no way. He thinks he's coming over to make progress to peace. You cannot make progress to peace with Hamas anywhere in charge, existing anywhere. That is the obstacle to peace.
Right. And Hamas doesn't want peace, but
of course it doesn't. It wants to see Israel annihilated, even if it has to do it in stages, which was, quite frankly and quite honestly, the intention of the Fatah PLO Palestinian Authority, a staged destruction of Israel. Hamas didn't want a staged destruction of Israel. They want to blow it up as quickly as they can. In other words, both sides of the Palestinian political, ideological divide have the same ultimate aim, which is Palestine from the river to the sea, as we heard chanting on the streets of Europe, London, and the United States. Mm-hmm. And these so-called peacemakers, the Blinkens of the world, keep maintaining the dream that the only solution is a two-state non-solution, based on the 1967 lines. I want to tell you, my organization, the Israel Institutes of Strategic Studies, are trying to do some fundraising right now because we want to make a documentary movie called 1967. And this movie is intended to show the world, the diplomats, the organizations that support them, the governments, the public, the press, what Israel would look like existing within 1967 borders, with the Palestinian state controlling the high grounds over the narrow coastal belt, the high grounds overlooking the Jordan Valley, in the streets of Jerusalem, also in Judea and Samaria. And we want to make this movie, making it, showing factually what would happen with the Hamas, or having their mass murderers as presidents or represented in the Palestinian Authority. Now, people like Blinken and others would say, well, this is delusional. Actually, they're delusional. What I'm talking about is facts on the ground. And we've just seen it in the last 2 weeks. We saw it in the streets of Jerusalem. We saw it in other places where even some of the local Arabs, the so-called Israeli Arabs, were being incited to take to the streets and kill Jews. This is why the poison, the Palestinian poison, must be removed. You can have no peace with this happen. Now, some of the other solutions may be involved a world without Palestine, or it could be a different situation. Instead of what they call a two-state solution, we could be talking about a 6-7 state solution, of which I could talk at a later time or later in the program, perhaps. But one thing that has to be crystal clear to a naive and politically, yes, stupid world, there is no such thing as a 1967 two-state solution. Who the heck are they deceiving? The deception that's been going on for 50 years is these people imagine a two-state solution, an agreement between Israel and the benign Palestinian Authority. They, for 50 years, have taken out the elephant in the room, or should I say the tiger in the room. They talked for 50 years as if Islamic terrorism like Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, didn't exist. And it's been there in the room all the time. They would have us agree to a state, go to bed with Mahmoud Abbas, wake up in the morning with Hamas, and say, well, it's up to you people to sort out your local differences. This is the insanity that Israel has been laboring under for 50 years, even after the Oslo Accord. They've maintained, these foolish diplomats have maintained this illusion. And basically, as I've said in the past, in other talks, this two-state solution is a dead camel.
The two-state solution.
It's dehydrated in the burning sands of the Middle East. And these European and American diplomats are still dragging this dead camel towards some distant oasis called peace.
Yeah,
they
Barry,
it's dead.
Barry, I just want to say that this is more sinister. I don't think it's just foolishness. I think it's sinister because if you want to destroy a country, you divide it. You just chop it up. You get one segment of the population against another. You weaken it by physically splitting the country up, and dividing land. The two-state solution is the final solution just being implemented because Israel cannot exist in 67 borders. The Arabs will be right there, as you know, and you say it yourself, that they will be shooting down our airplanes at our international airport as they come down because they will be that close to it. And they will be uprising everywhere, which we just saw. And we cannot exist. Israel would be left to a 9-mile wide bottleneck where they could cut the country in two and further defeat us. We cannot live with a two-state solution.
Yeah, exactly.
And we have 60 seconds. Go ahead.
Well, on this point, that we produced a brochure, and this is why I said there is a need for a documentary movie, because we went up to an Arab village called Rantis, which is just over the 1967 border, and we took photographs. I want to tell you, Tamar, you see these photographs. We took photographs looking down on Ben Gurion Airport. We watched as planes took off and came down. This is in Palestine, 67. What would happen if one Palestinian with an RPG blew up a plane on Ben Gurion Airport? Who would fly into Israel tomorrow?
No one. People would be too afraid.
Then? Well, we have to remove the Palestinian state that we forced on Israel.
Right, and no airline would want to fly here if a plane, God forbid, was shot down. Anyway, we have to go to a break. We're going to be right back. Don't go anywhere.
Are you interested in transforming your life, drawing closer to the Creator, and uncovering the deeper meanings and hidden treasures in the Hebrew Bible?
Then join me, Rav Yitzhak Michelson,
And me, William Hall,
on the Science of Kabbalah, where we are seeking to narrow the gap between what we understand of our physical and spiritual worlds. So make sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Hello, I am Walter Bingham. If you want to hear the news behind the news and the true perspective on world affairs, then the Walter Bingham File is the program for you. We bring you interviews with the movers and shakers, political commentaries, and on-the-spot reports of events as they happen. All here every Tuesday, 4 p.m. Israel time, 9 a.m. Eastern time. And it's all archived on our website. Make it a date.
All right, we are back here at the Tamar Yonah Show on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. It has been a fiery break here with Barry and I talking back and forth. But we're going to turn our focus now over the pond, on the other side of the pond, and that's to the United States, because so much is happening there with rioting in the streets of anti-Semitism under the guise of being anti-Zionist, talking about Israel, yet they're attacking Americans. Americans are attacking Americans, the American Jews, who are not Israeli citizens, but yet they say it's a Zionist cause. So who is supporting this? Who is supporting the Hamas? We are speaking with our guest Barry Shaw, who is the International Public Diplomacy Director at the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies. And Barry, where do you want to take us now with the focus on what's happening in the United States?
Well, I want to tell you, I am very saddened, almost angry. I remember talking to you some years ago. At the time we were discussing Jeremy Corbyn in Britain, who was the head of the Labour Party, as Britain was on its way to an election. And I was highlighting the vehement anti-Israel, anti-Semitism of Jeremy Corbyn that really poisoned his party. His party, from Parliament to local branch officers, were infected by anti-Semites waving Palestinian flags. I remember talking to you about a Labour Party annual conference in which the assembly hall, the meeting halls, people were waving Palestinian flags. Didn't even see any British flags. And they were passing resolutions supporting the Palestinians. And in their orders of priority heading for an election, Palestine issues were number 4, even above pensioners for old age people, healthcare, welfare, whatever. This is how insane it went. And there was a huge campaign taken up to have people walk away from the Labour Party. And it started with 1 or 2 Labour Jewish members of Parliament, including women, who began to tell the public about the anti-Semitism in their party. And other non-Jewish members of British Parliament walked away from their seats in Parliament and walked away from a party they had been a member of for 30 and 40 years because they couldn't stand the anti-Semitism, and along with it came the anti-Israelism. And I predicted it wouldn't be long before this poison would leap across the pond, the Atlantic, and take root in America. And it began with the introduction of people like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. And people dismissed it. And then people like Ilhan Omar started making sneaky anti-Semitic remarks like the people with the Benjamins. They were really referring to the Jews who supported her, the Democrat Jews who supported her, campaigned for her, and gave her election money for her to make it into Congress. And then she turned on them.
Barry, if I can jump in here, I want to just say also, I remember President Biden saying to Rashida Tlaib that he's worried about her grandmother or something like that. And he's going to make sure that her grandmother, in referring, meaning Palestine, is going to be safe. Right. But, what about the Jewish grandmothers? What about my kid's grandmother who's being attacked? The Hamas is the aggressor here, and they are legally recognized as terrorists, and he's saying he wants to protect this entity. It's just crazy, but not the Jewish grandmothers. Go ahead.
I think it was embarrassing when I saw about a week ago, that Biden was about to get on a plane and he was being harangued by Rashida Tlaib at the foot of the stairs leading up to the plane. This is a situation with what? We had, for instance, Biden's press secretary, Jen Psaki, saying at the time, talking about Israel move to evict Palestinians in East Jerusalem, work against our common interest in achieving a solution to the conflict. So here you had Biden's press secretary misinterpreting what was going on in Sheikh Jarrah, where Arabs were being evicted having lived in Jewish properties for 40 years, and through a court system, they hadn't paid rent. The court or the owners of the Jewish property had requested that these Arabs at least pay rent, including back rent, and the Arabs had refused. So the Jerusalem court actually moved to evict people as they would do in any normal society.
Right, it's a case of law and order.
Press secretary turning it into something completely different,
right.
Something very controversial, in fact, a lie, talking about this is something to do with the solution of the conflict. I thought America was a country of laws.
Right.
And these people are living, but it got worse than that. Because of time, let's go on to some other people. You think that the people who are anti-Semitic and hate Israel are four ladies of the squad. It goes deeper because every time the Democrats elect somebody else to the House in Congress, it's usually another person who's anti-Semitic who hates Israel. And I was on a show in America where I pointed out a representative woman called Cori Bush. It's a woman, Coribush, who's a Black Lives Matter person. And she stood up in Congress and said, I stand in solidarity with Hamas resistance. And she complained, in her words, about our tax dollars going to the Israeli military. My community in St. Louis has sent me here to save lives. That means we oppose our money going to military activity, all this sort of nonsense. You know? And they didn't know about it over there. And they went to search it out, and word for word, that's exactly what has happened. You have people in the Democrat Party standing up in Congress and calling us war criminals and supporting an Islamic terror organization who has fired over 4,000 rockets. And they made a move in America, the squad and the Democrats, forget it, the squad. The Democrats overwhelmingly voted in America to defund American funds for our Iron Dome missile defense system. The Iron Dome is not an offensive weapon. It's a defense system. And they know, the Democrats, that it's a defense system, but they want to remove our protection, our defense from future Hamas or Hezbollah rockets.
Insane.
Isn't this madness?
Yes. And anti-Semitism. And that you can have Congress people, U.S. Congress women, cheering for a terrorist organization against the victims in this in Israel. And yet now, even after the ceasefire, who's getting all this money injected into it? It's the aggressor, Hamas terror organization, and not Israel, who was the victim, who was the one that was attacked. But they're rebuilding Gaza. They're not helping Israel.
But okay, you talk about anti-Semitism. But I want to tell you, in the time I've got remaining, what has happened in America is too many Jews have wandered away from traditional Jewish values. And part of that has been walking away from any support of Israel. And because they've adopted this ridiculous woke progressivism, they are now talking about they have to have a even-handed approach between Israel under attack from an Islamic terror organization in Gaza. And this includes people like the rabbi of the Reform movement. And also this rabbi called about a cycle of violence, delayed peace and increased bloodshed. What does he mean by a cycle of violence? We're being hit by 4,000 rockets, and when we respond, we are contributing, in his words, to a cycle of violence. What nonsense is this from a Jewish religious head?
From an ethical head. Barry, we only have one more minute, so what do you want to leave us with?
Well, I just want to close off on another one, because I wrote a piece against another Jew who appeared on television, a guy called Geraldo Rivera. And he appeared on the Hannity show. What he was talking about was dead Palestinian children. What about the dead Palestinian children? He kept bleating 3 or 4 times. He didn't talk about any Israeli Jewish kids who had died. It was only Palestinian kids. This is the pathetic hypocrisy of Jewish liberalism. They've got to get to their senses. Any people who are listening to this, Jew or non-Jew, who voted for the Democrats, thinking that they would help stand solidly behind Israel in its hour of need, it's time for you people to walk away, just like the members of the Labour Party in Britain walk away when the penny dropped over there and they realised their party was heading not only to be anti-Israel, against Israel, but it always comes with a strong strain of anti-Semitism. And it's happening in your Democrat Party over there in America. It is time to Jexit. It's time to walk away until your party or your old party manages to reform itself as the Labour Party managed to do in Britain.
Sadly, what you say is true. And the Democrats are trying to bring back the two-state final solution, which we know never worked and can never work. Israel cannot survive. They want to split us. They want to weaken us. And then they use words, as you said, that we want to use even-handedness. That's like saying we should use even-handedness with the Taliban against the United States, troops that are trying to take them out. All right. Yeah. Well, people it's not just an interest of wisening up, but your morality as well. We all have to do a self-examination. Thank you so much for being with us, Barry Shaw from the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamar, for having me, and I hope most of your listeners, take the message very seriously.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
If you're hearing this message, everyone else can too. Advertise with Israel News Talk Radio and get your message out to people. We'll build a personalized package for you. Contact advertising at israelnewstalkradio.com.
Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey, this is Jake in Anchorage, Alaska, and I love listening to all the super interesting interviews and up-to-date information on what's happening in Israel.
Hello, this is Anna King, originally from London, now living in Israel. And what can I say? Israel News Talk Radio is my cup of tea.
My name is Bhaskar. I'm from India, and I love listening because you get to know the truth and wonderful voices from this lovely country.
Mom! Okay, wait a minute. Hi, this is Chava Dax, and I'm calling for the rolling hills of Ma'ale Adumim, just north of Jerusalem. I always listen to Israel News Talk Radio to get all the latest news and commentary and to keep me up to date every day.
This is Sarah Dax from Ma'ale Adumim, and I'm 12. I wish Israel News Talk Radio was boring so my mom wouldn't listen to it all the time. Mom!
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.